Professor Baldwin, thanks for accepting to have this interview.
My pleasure.
I know that you must be a little tired after being involved in a whole day discussion on the new globalization, as was the term of the. And I guess the good way to start is, in Mexico there is a perception, because of the arrival of Mr. Trump, that there is a big attack or a big discomfort with the idea globalization and the benefits that it has had to the U.S. and to Mexico and other countries. And now the United States, having been the country that always supported the idea free trade, etc., now changing its position, and the President of the United States attacking globalization and saying that it hasn't been beneficial to the U.S. What is your, and I know you have a new book. I haven't been able to complete it, but I browsed through it and I find your approach very interesting. And I was wondering if you could give us a sense of what is your view on what you call the new globalization.
Sure. So let me start with the anti-globalization thing. So I think there is a narrative kind of growing around the world that there's this big backlash against globalization. And I think that narrative needs a lot more nuance than it's getting. So it's true in the United States there is an upswelling of people who fear that globalization has been bad for the United States. But I would point out that that is not new. There's always been a core of people who were anti-trade in the United States. What's different is it got blown up and validated at the national level. What I'd also point out that that's conflated with immigration. So globalization and immigration are not the same thing. One can just use words like openness. But if you go to Europe, for example, in the UK, when they voted for Brexit, which was in some sense a rejection of close ties to Europe, but at the same time their prime minister is saying they're a champion of global free trade. So really Brexit for them was about limiting migration, but they wanted to do free trade. And if you go around Europe, you'll see lots of countries where there's a backlash against immigration, especially the Syrian immigration and then the Libyan one before it. But generally speaking, the people support globalization. So I think it needs more nuance. But let's take the United States. It's for real in the U.S. The way I kind of explain it is that the new globalization is affecting the economy with a finer degree of resolution. So instead of just like in the 70s and 80s, Japanese competition in cars caused a lot of pain to the U.S. industry, but it was the entire U.S. industry who was threatened with the entire Japanese industry. It was like Team U.S. against Team Japan. With the new globalization, where the factories have been unbundled and outsourced to Mexico, Canada, or wherever, that is much less of a team thing. So it's affecting not the entire industry, only little bits of the industry. And so it's made winners and losers, high-skilled, low-skilled, in a confusing way. And those changes have been relatively sudden, they've been relatively unpredictable, and they seem uncontrollable. So I think even if people haven't been directly touched by them, this creates a sort of a fragility or vulnerability, a sense that people are economically disenfranchised. So even if they're not directly hit by it, they fear it. And that I think is new, and I think it is due to the nature of the new globalization. I have other explanations, but talking about Trump all day long, I could do, but that's my basic line.
But then I think a basic framework of your approach of the new globalization has to do with global chains.
Value chains, yeah.
Value chains. Could you, in Mexico we had previously visits like Gary Jarefi and things, so people who know about the topic really understand that. But general public probably who will watch this video would not understand very well the concept. Could you elaborate a little bit?
Sure. So let me try and do that a little bit historically. Let me start with what I would call the old globalization, which I think many of us are used to. And that's essentially a good is made here and sold there. So the good crossing the border is trade. And to many people who think this way, with 20th century, 19th century way, globalization is still mostly about goods crossing borders. And then what stops it is trade costs or tariffs or things like that. Now what I would call the new globalization is where factories cross borders, not just goods. And that changes a lot of things because the flows of things that happened inside, say, US factories, let's say in Detroit, goods, services, people, training, capital, all moving around inside the same factory, is now part of international commerce. So when part of that factory is moved to Mexico, what we call trade has become radically more complicated and more connected. So you need people to go back and forth. You need capital to go back and forth. But above all, you need know-how. So the really big thing that changed with that outsourcing and offshoring with the new globalization is that U.S. companies were sending their know-how, how to make things, to Mexico. Let me just take an example. Actually, it's a Canadian company called Bombardier who makes small aircraft. And they decided to move the production of the tail of one of their business aircrafts to Mexico.
To Querétaro, no?
Yes, to Querétaro. That's right. I didn't dare to try to pronounce it, but I'm glad you tried. You did it. That is exactly where it is.
Okay.
But you know, they can't just rely on Mexican know-how to make the tail of their jet, because it has to fit in with the rest of the jet. So the really new thing about that is the Canadians are sending the know-how, the managerial, marketing, technical know-how to make planes. And that changes the nature of globalization. It's no longer made here, sold there. What you see is a kind of a multinational blend of competitiveness, which is then making Bombardier more competitive with the European producers or the Asian producers or the Brazilian producers. So that's what I think is really different. It's knowledge crossing borders, not just goods. Or another way to say that, it's factories crossing borders and all the things that are complicated because of that. And that's why it's really, really different. So the word, Gary Gareffi is the one who invented the word global value chains.
You recognize that in your book, I noticed.
Yes,
yeah,
yes.
Okay.
And
so Gary must be flattered.
Well, I've learned a great deal from Gary. He's one of these people who really knows things. He goes to the factories and he runs. I've been with him in China, for example. Yes. But so you know, that global value chain idea is that the factory is adding value across the world. That's what or global supply chains is another word for it. And that's not just the goods moving back and forth. You really have to see that it changes the nature of international commerce. Now, I would almost argue that we should go back to the old word. We used to call it international commerce, and then everybody started saying international trade. But perhaps we should go back to international commerce. I know in Spanish, actually, there's the same words, but in any case,
difficult to separate,
separate them. But it's definitely more complicated, and I think that's what the big change is.
But let me ask you. What I know that Bombardier had a major sort of a study about where they should place that factory, about the details. And somehow, as far as I understand, it was Asia, a lot of places reviewed, and they decided for Querétaro. Any sense, because in your book you talk about some decisions had to do with proximity.
Yes, yes.
Some others have to do with other factors, but is that the reason mainly because they decided to place that factory in Mexico?
Yeah.
Or any other idea what?
Absolutely. No, I think that's why. That's why I think you can talk about factory North America, and it's not just for aircraft. Things are made Canada, Mexico, and the U.S. In this regional supply chains. The word global really doesn't apply except for a few industries, but it's regional. So in the book, I like to focus on three things that are hindering globalization: the cost of moving goods, the cost of moving ideas, and the cost of moving people. Now, the cost of moving goods came down in the 19th century with steam engines and then diesel and all that sort of stuff. So now it's really quite cheap to ship goods across different places. And with the information and communication technology revolution around 1990 with internet and cheap phones and good communication, it became easy to move knowledge back and forth. And in my mind, that's what enabled this internationalization of production. So if you think about it before, if you went back to 1980, I'm sure you remember 1980, when you organized things, you had to send airmail letters or fax, which were terrible. So can you imagine trying to coordinate the production of a plane by fax or phone call? It would be impossible. But now they have real-time, instantaneous, continuous communication between the factories to make sure everything's working together. So in my mind, it was the communication and technology revolution which enabled it, which made it possible to separate the factories. And then it was the wage differences that drove it.
Okay.
But in this three level, the last one, the cost of moving people, has not come down very much, because the cost of airfares have come down somewhat, but it's still very costly in terms of time. So and when you do a production network like an airplane, you still need people to go back and forth between the factories, the managers, key technicians, things like that. And as a consequence, if Canada puts that in Mexico, the technician, he loses 1 day at most of travel to go there. If he puts it in Thailand, he loses a whole week.
Yeah.
So I think that the cost of moving people leads to a regionalization. And then also you can, people say, like, with these goods going back and forth several times, each time you add on the trade cost. So it's not a small difference. If you put the thing back and forth across the border 3 or 4 times, then you add up those things, and even relatively small trade cost differences can matter.
Okay, okay. And so, and would you say the perception in Mexico is that Bombardier came to Querétaro, etc., because there was a sort of an institutional framework that was provided by the NAFTA. And for what you are saying is not necessarily the case. NAFTA probably had an influence, but it was more the costs and the proximity. Is that right?
Right. Well, I think
what did NAFTA do you think the NAFTA agreement had to do with also the decision to raise a...
Sure, I think it was critical because if it made the trade policy certain. And moreover, with NAFTA, it's not as deep as some of the agreements, but basically there was assurances. The Canadians felt assurances that they would be able to put investment in, take investment out. There'd be rules that there was a kind of ongoing cooperation which would be difficult to break. So they could rely on that, Mexico as a place to go to. NAFTA, I think, was critical in that. Some countries, like say China, doesn't have any of these agreements, but the government promises the companies that's going to stay that way, and some people, that works for some people. So I think NAFTA was really, in some sense, I think things like NAFTA and TPP are the rules that underpin this new globalization. They go way beyond just removing tariffs. They are also rules of protecting intellectual property rights, allowing people to go in and out, to allow the capital to go in and out, to allow the excellent business services to be provided. So all those things are kind of part and parcel, and they're all wrapped up in NAFTA. And the fact they're in one agreement gives the Canadian company the courage, the assurance that it'll stay that way. And then you build a factory that's going to last 20 years.
This is what in the literature you talk credible commitments.
Exactly.
Somehow. And so Mexico made this, negotiated this NAFTA and other agreements with the EU and others, and created a sort of an environment that created certainty.
Absolutely.
But somehow, I have another question. You mentioned China too. In Mexico, there is a sense that, for instance, now with the renegotiation of NAFTA, some people say NAFTA is not necessarily, it's not that important. That other factors are more important. Look at China. China doesn't have any those agreements, and somehow it has been able to capture the U.S. market and displace Mexico from certain sectors like textiles, apparel. What I know that's a big question, and maybe it's not very clear. But what has made China so competitive in terms of being able to, despite the fact of the distance, long distance, displace Mexico and other countries from the U.S. market and capturing the U.S. market? Can you give us a sense on the basis of your framework?
Sure. So in the beginning, it was very easy. It was a very, very low wage for quite capable factory workers. And the government was very welcoming, this straight from 1990, was very welcoming to foreign companies to come in and do processing trade. And they had these special regimes where you could import all the parts and components and export it duty-free, called processing trade. And so essentially you were getting very low cost, pretty good labor to do labor-intensive processing. Now that was, many countries have started that way. What was China's genius is they leveraged their market share, their market size, and the fact that they have a 9% external tariff to kind of encourage or cajole companies to bring more jobs in. So they had a densified participation. Not so much that they were moving up or down one particular value chain, but they just got lots of more good jobs. And then the government was able to then turn it into skills and clusters of skills in which it became truly attractive, even not just with the low wages. Then they started pushing even further into this indigenous innovation sort of thing, which basically involved technology transfer from the foreign companies inward. Now China can do that because they have 1.3 billion people, and their income was going up at 10% per year. I talked to one American vice president of a auto company, and he said, "We know that China we're teaching China how to make cars. This was 10 years ago. But we can't do anything about it because it's the fastest growing market in the world. And if you're not in China, you don't have the scale to sell anywhere. So China really has unique advantages. It comes from its very large scale and the fact that the government says what it means and means what it says. I mean, in terms of manufacturing. So if if they say we're going to do this, then they do that. And it's very efficient and they have a plan. So whereas many other countries over the last 20 years, they do this, they're pro this, they're anti that, you never know what's going on. So I think China really is something that you shouldn't pay too much attention to. Or until you get 1 billion people, and they're growing at 10% for 2 decades in a row, then come back and talk to me. But otherwise, China really is a one-off. It's pretty much, it's reached its acceleration of the manufacturing moving to China has slowed down. So I think that was the key. I mean, deep down, it was low wages with good infrastructure and good institutions.
And you could almost say that that's the same case for Mexico. That we have good institutions in terms of NAFTA, and you have the location and you have low wages. But somehow, China has maintained the competitiveness and the wages have gone up. Right. And somehow in Mexico there is a lot of criticism that we continue with this strategy of having low wages. Do you think that's what makes Mexico so attractive, the low wage, or
well, it's gone way beyond that now. I think at least there's more sophisticated jobs coming down here and skilled workers, not just factory workers, but there's more skilled workers are getting jobs. I think, I'm not an expert on Mexico, but from what I understand, the complaints is that if you go to Querétaro or someplace like that, or some places along the border, it's all working great, lots of good jobs and things like that, but it hasn't spread to the other parts of the country. And so in some sense, it's been a relatively uneven thing. Now with China, they made a very conscious decision to move from being a factory economy to a headquarter economy. And I'm not sure Mexico really has done that. I'm not sure they could do it, but China has decided to leverage their market size. Can you explain
a little bit more what you mean by headquarters?
So there's Chinese cars. They make their own car company, the Great Wall of China. And there's the laptops. They bought out IBM and the washing machines and things like that. They're starting to make their own brands and do their own designs. So in some sense, they're starting to do what Japan did. After the war, where they developed these big brands, Sony and Mitsubishi and all those, Toyota. Those brands didn't really exist after the war. They made a conscious effort to develop their own brands, and that's what China has done. Now, I'm not saying that Mexico should do that, because I'm not sure that there really is, you don't have the leverage for that. But in any case, I think that's what's quite different. China has managed to jump over. But all told, I mean, the Mexican per capita income is higher than it is in China.
Yes.
So
yes, I know.
You can envy their growth, but they envy your lifestyle.
And human, other factors. Other factors right. We have to be taken into account. Yeah. But now, would you say that with the NAFTA, you already mentioned that facilitated Mexico to be able to attract companies like Bombardier, etc. Yeah. And the way that the people have interpreted NAFTA is that they have also given help to create value, global, regional value chains. And one of the ones that are seen as the perfect example is the automotive.
Sure.
And somehow do you see there Mexico placed as in the way you see your framework as playing an important role in the regional chain? Sure.
So I mean, basically, the U.S. industry in cars would not be competitive without Mexico parts and components or Canadian. So the misunderstanding of like the Trump administration or many of the people in there is that there is such a thing as U.S. industry. No, the U.S. doesn't make stuff anymore. The U.S. designs things, they organize the production, and they make certain bits and pieces themselves. But if they close the border tomorrow, they could not make any cars. They could not make any planes. They couldn't make almost anything because America has taken advantage of the cost savings, the productivity enhancing bits of global value chains. And the U.S. is not in a vacuum. Germany does it in Poland and the Czech Republic and Turkey. And if America wants to compete with German cars, they need to also outsource the labor-intensive things rather than paying high wages. And Japan does the same thing in Thailand or Philippines or China. So it's really a global competition, and the nature of manufacturing has completely changed. No one country can put that back. They can try, but it won't work.
And do you think, and so for what you're saying, probably the idea of Mr. Trump of a 25% tariff on cars that are made in, would that work? Or what would that imply for if that was carried out?
Right. See, the thing is, he's thinking of the old world where things are made here and sold there. So he's thinking, and as a USTR did this in the early 1980s, they did that against Japan. They put up these voluntary export restraints, and the Japanese did move the production to the United States. And so that I think that's the world they're thinking in. But if you put up that tariff, the cars in the U.S. would be very expensive and become uncompetitive against foreign cars. And let's suppose they put up the tariffs enough so that there was actually some of this movement back. Two problems. One, it would be creating jobs for robots, not American workers in the factories. And two, this is only for sales to the U.S. market. You can be sure that the American companies, in order to stay competitive with Europeans and the Asians, would offshore more export production to Canada and Mexico. Because if they were producing expensive cars in the United States, but those were protected against competition by high tariffs, that's not true outside the United States. So these tariffs would actually make the U.S. a high-cost island in manufacturing. And if you put the tariffs high enough, then people will make for the American market in America, but for export, they'd make it somewhere else.
Okay. But then, how do you account for the Ford company having not decided to start a new factory here and move out to the United States? Sort of a threat from the Trump administration.
Sure. That was in the first months. He was making very clear threats, which are, first of all, those have stopped, and second of all, it's very unclear what would have happened otherwise. So a lot of this, I saved 1,000 jobs here, 100 jobs here. What's the alternative? And how long does that? Is that locked in for history, for all the future? We don't know. So a lot of this stuff, I think, is mostly PR. And I understand that Ford's decision may very well have been influenced by Trump's pressure at the time. But the world goes on more than one just factory at a time. And I feel that the Trump administration's antipathy to trade and globalization has been reduced quite substantially, partly because he's got more people in the administration who actually understand trade. And another word is that he's starting to listen to the American companies who need these global value chains to stay competitive. Whereas before, he was relatively uninformed with trade, listening to people who did not understand modern industry, and, sounded good. So he said that, all sorts of things. Okay.
Now, if you don't mind, let's get to NAFTA, which is, I guess, one of the main concerns. What do you see, well, as you already mentioned, threats that Mr. Trump made at the beginning of his administration or even before have already been, now we're talking about modernization of NAFTA, but somehow still continue saying we need to reduce the deficit. And so for Mexico, that creates uncertainty, because what do you mean? I mean, we have a trade surplus now, but we have a deficit with other countries, and the one with the United States, the surplus helps us to maintain the other ones, and so it's a trade-off in different sectors, whatever. But what do you see? In Mexico, the perception is that for many years we were trying to find new ways to modernize NAFTA, and you probably know Gary's half-powers pieces or whatever, and somehow we haven't been able to make progress. What would be necessary to be able to make NAFTA play a sort of a more important role, or free trade a more important role in terms of making Canada, Mexico, and the United States more sort of a competitive in terms of this value, global chains or whatever?
Sure.
Any ideas of which sectors, which areas are in need of modernization, of improvement, or of opening?
Sure.
I think services probably would have to be put into the table. But any of the ideas of where you
Well,
would go?
Yeah, so let me answer your question generally first and then in specific second.
Okay.
So in general, I think that the economy is very different. The world economy is very different now than it was in '94 when NAFTA was signed. In particular, there's all sorts of products and services which didn't exist.
Okay.
You know, so the e-commerce, Amazon, all those sorts of things just didn't exist. So clearly, it needs to be upgraded in terms of
e-commerce will be a chapter.
E-commerce is an obvious one. All sorts of things like standards and keeping the process of keeping keeping the agreement up to date could also be improved. But to answer it specifically, I think it's whatever they do with NAFTA is going to look a lot like what you agreed to in TPP already. And in one sense, you already have modernized NAFTA by agreeing to a TPP which had the U.S., Canada, and Mexico in it. So this idea that we need to update NAFTA is something that's been around forever. And of course, it's true. A 20-year-old agreement with the world we've seen does need to be upgraded. But most people thought it was going to happen in TPP, and then that would be superseded. Those rules would supersede. So I think what you're actually going to see in NAFTA is rules that were agreed in TPP, which includes e-commerce and all sorts of services, brought into NAFTA. So to me, that of course it won't be exactly the same, but I think that's if you want to think about what will happen, just look to see what's in TPP.
Okay, but in TPP, for instance, the rule of origin for the automotive was lowered down.
Right.
And I don't know whether that would...
No, I think it'll go up, probably.
Probably.
But as we were discussing at the seminar today, that's not all bad for Mexico. Because if you have rules of origin...
Sorry.
No trouble.
I thought I had turned it off. Sorry.
It's the president of Mexico.
No, of course. let me turn it off. Sorry.
No worries.
Okay.
So as we were talking in the seminar about rules of origin, if they make the rules of origin in NAFTA tighter, as long as they're really rules of origin for the NAFTA region.
The three parties.
Yeah, it has to be.
Not the U.S. only.
No, not just the U.S. only. Then it's protecting you from China. So actually, tighter rules of origin in auto need not be all bad for Mexico. I'm not a big fan of rules of origin, and I think they're somewhat distortive, especially the NAFTA types of rules of origin, which tend to be very specific. And they have, chapter things. But in any case, the rules of origin is a big issue, but I'm not sure it's the one that's going to cause real damage. What I think that could blow up the whole thing is if they start talking about bilateral deficits. But so far, that has gone, if there's one, Wilbur Ross, but especially Peter Navarro, was all on about this thing. And it's the same story we had with Japan. If you go, I was in the Bush administration in 1990-91 in the White House. This is Bush Sr., and that back then, it was a bilateral deficit with China that got everybody excited. And there was a big discussion, and we had to debunk the economics of it and all that. And it got smoothed out. And it seems that already the discussion of bilateral deficits or trade deficits is coming down. So, for example, it was not in Leitseger's letter to Congress about announcing that. Yeah, I know. And they haven't insisted putting it into... In G20, they didn't let them talk about trade at all. And in the G7, the U.S. insisted that they talk mostly about fair trade, not free trade. And it was unclear, but it didn't really get in there. So I think as Leitseger and other people who know a lot more about trade than the Trump campaign did come in, I think that will tend to come down. But that's the danger.
Yes.
If they try to fix bilateral deficits with trade agreements, first of all, it will not work, and it will be very disruptive.
Yeah, and could it be... do you think they may be thinking something like safeguards, something that the WTO allows, something not permanent, but for very particular reasons? I close the border, but then after a while, do you think they're thinking about that when they say safeguards, or what do they mean by that?
So safeguards is every trade agreement the WTO has. If something suddenly happened, it's like letting the steam off if it gets too hard. And it's a healthy thing because you can't foresee everything, and every government knows that sometimes they face this irresistible pressure to help the workers adjust. It just can't be an excuse for permanent. So it would really depend upon, the devil would be in the details. There's it's perfectly healthy to have safeguards in trade agreements. In fact, all trade agreements have some aspects of it.
But they expired already in NAFTA, so
right,
they will be reinstated
yeah.
somehow.
So, but it depends. If it's disciplined, if it's evidence-based, if it's time-limited, then I don't see the big problem. I think also if they start talking more about expanding U.S. exports rather than reducing U.S. imports, that's the healthy direction we want this. So when you have a deficit, and that's what happened with Japan as well. So the U.S. government and the Japanese government didn't want to have the Super 301 protection, which was threatened by Congress. And so they started talking about the U.S. exporting more to Japan, not the U.S. importing less from Japan. And that's the, if somehow or another we could turn the whole conversation to U.S. export expansion instead of U.S. import contraction, that would be a really healthy way to do it.
That would be great, but perhaps then the surplus will be reduced, and we will have to increase it in other.
Well, so this whole surplus thing is really very, very complicated, especially in global value chains, because you have to import to export. So you can't just reduce one without reducing the other.
Okay.
So it's not like the old days where, you know, U.S. is selling corn to Mexico. If Mexico puts up the tariff, you will import less corn. But when it's car parts, if you put up the tariffs, one way I like to think of, like, now we have this factory in North America, and what putting tariffs up in NAFTA would be like trying to build a wall in the middle of the factory to move some jobs from the end of the assembly line to the beginning of the assembly line. And it might work, it might have a few jobs, but the main thing is it makes the factory less competitive overall. And I think that is the problem, that this idea that we can reduce our imports by putting up tariffs is based on 20th century reasoning, and it doesn't work when really what you have is factories crossing borders. So that's why I hope they will get away from that.
Now, factories crossing borders, I remember Gary and I wrote a paper a few years ago after 2001 and trying to understand what the implications of the 2001 phenomenon. And what we found out is that the U.S. was going to start putting some, how to say, barriers in the border. And they are being, at the beginning they were put into place, but then the Traveler Trusted Program somehow are trying to help that. But somehow to facilitate, but somehow they're still there. And there is this concern about terrorists crossing the border and bringing something. And so do you see any way in which, what kind of policies could be set up at the border to be able to sort of make it easier to cross? And because it seems that it's becoming complicated for Mexico to cross the border in an efficient way. Right.
So part of it, I think, is inevitable. It's just we live in a much uglier world than when we signed NAFTA in terms of terrorism and things like that. But on the other hand, there's some hope that technology can try and pre-approve these things, so you have the inspectors in the factories in Mexico and you seal the containers, and there are some technological workaround. But I think deep down it's impossible to have the kind of border-free travel. So I live in Europe, and this idea that you can all cross without passports, the Schengen area, which we had for a long time, that's starting to break down because of the terrorism. Yeah. So people are checking, even when you go into Germany, they may check your passport, even though they never used to do that. And legally, that you're supposed to be able to go in without it. But in Schengen, for example, they have these safeguards that if there's a problem, they can check. So I think part of it is just the nature of the world we're in. And the only way to get around with it is to really cooperate inside the borders to make the security border, even inside Mexico, the factories and whatever. So that I think part of it's inevitable. Other parts of it are fixed by technology.
Now, on browsing your book, I didn't read it. Maybe the question will make sense. No. But you say that the third phase, the future phase of globalization, would be movement of labor. Is that, did I understand right? And so I don't know whether I read it wrong or right, but do you foresee any possibility in the future in which there might be a different perception about migration or movement of people, services, understood as services or whatever? Right. So I think you talk about that.
Yeah, I do, but I talk about the movement of labor services, but not laborers. So to me, so now we're moving on to the future, and so we're just making it up, right? Nobody knows the future, but that doesn't excuse us, because it's not just unknowable; it's inevitable. So we have to think forward. Now, the way I'm thinking about this now is that advanced communication technologies are making it easier for people to provide services as if they were actually there. So this telepresence and telerobotics and virtual reality and machine translation, instantaneous machine translation, will make it increasingly possible for, say, a Mexican car mechanic to operate a robot that fixes cars in the United States without actually being there.
Oh.
Or a Mexican in south of Mexico to operate a lawnmower in somebody's backyard instead of actually being in the backyard. So I think these advanced communication technology allow the labor services to move without the laborer. So that's the third unbundling, where the service, labor service, and the labor, or the worker, the work and the worker get separated. So I think that's the next big wave of globalization, that the penetration of the service sector.
But that would mean that Mexico would have to have a policy of educating people to be able to fulfill those kind of...
Well, so first of all, people, I mean, how this stuff is, the key feature of technology today is it's easy. You know, nobody reads a manual to know how to operate an iPhone. So this technology, let's say how you operate a robot, would certainly be no more complicated than a video game. And so I don't think it's a huge barrier. I think it's true that you definitely start with people who know how to use a computer or at least a smartphone. If you go below that level, probably they can't participate in this economy. And it definitely requires great connectivity and you know, big bandwidth and things like that. But those are coming very quickly. It's becoming very, very cheap. I also think that it would help if the Mexican government, in some sense, provided a way of putting a stamp of approval on certain people. So you're going to buy labor services from a Mexican nurse or a doctor or whatever. There needs to be a way that the American consumers know that it's actually somebody who knows what they're talking about, or an accountant, or somebody who knows how to format your spreadsheets,
but that would
or whatever.
Have to be negotiated with the United States, no?
Well, I think yeah, it's possible that it will come.
Certification on
No. So it's possible it will come that way. But look at Uber, for example, or eBay. There's no government to government there. Oh. And somehow or another, people
it
trust.
Has to be okay.
So it's possible that it would go through, like TripAdvisor, or yeah, so through some sort of, basically. But my suggestion is that the Mexican government could take charge of that and get ahead of the game by providing these certifications. Now that doesn't. I'm not saying that the Mexican doctor will be certified to practice medicine in America, but for example, if my kid scraped their knee or had a big cut, and I want to know, does it need stitches or does it not? Now you have to go to the emergency room and sit there for hours. I could just call up a Mexican doctor and he would say, yeah, that one you got to go to the hospital, and that one, no, just put a Band-Aid on it. So something like that, which is short of providing or accounting services, and it could be many, many different kinds of services. Mm-hmm. So this is not science fiction. Yeah, so there's something called the gig economy, as you maybe followed in the United States with Mechanical Turk or TaskRabbit. So that's essentially that, but it becomes international. And the second big technological change, which I think most people are underestimating, is real-time machine translation. Instantaneous translation is coming. It's already not bad. There's a program on the iPhone called iTranslate, and there are a number of products coming out where you hold the iPhone like this and you have an earpiece like this, and you speak Spanish and I hear you speaking English. I speak English and you hear me speaking Spanish. So this is not science fiction, and it's not perfect yet, but the processing speeds are doubling every year, and the communication and storage are doubling every year. So in just a few years, I think the language barrier will evaporate. So the guy in Chiapas will be driving a lawnmower in Texas and speaking to the house owner in English. And that guy speaks English and he hears it in Mexican. So I think that will change a lot of things. People have, my advice is go on the internet and look up machine translation or iTranslate, and you'll see some amazing videos. And every year it gets twice as good. So it's something that's going to change the nature of trade radically.
Okay, thank you. So you, I guess in the conference you were asked a lot of questions about NAFTA, and you gave your perception, for what I can gather, is that probably everything is getting right in the terms of the negotiation. I think the three countries realize the importance of maintaining the agreement and the need to modernize it. Is that what you concluded in the? So
I'm certainly optimistic.
You are.
But we are dealing with a relatively unpredictable administration, which is definitely pulled in different directions. So inside the Trump White House, there are people who essentially have the same attitude towards trade as Bush Jr. did. And then there are other people who are a completely different populist attitude where trade is bad.
Mr. Bannon, but Mr. Bannon is not.
Bannon is a classic one of them.
Yes.
And so you sort of hear, it seems like whoever talked to Trump latest has the ear. But I think there's sort of the people who understand the benefits of trade and the complexity of trade are starting to come to the fore. And the new USTR, Leitziger, is actually one of these. Oh, he's deep down somewhat protectionist, but not in the way that he's going to blow up the system. He wants a tariff here or a tariff there, slow it down, get a better deal for American exporters. But these are things that American administrations have always wanted, just in a little different degree. The bomb throwers in the administration could blow the whole thing up. I hope not, and it doesn't look like that way. But it's difficult. There is still that ultimate uncertainty.
Now, if worse comes to worse, and Mr. Trump doesn't been able to get any major victory over all the plans he had, and he decides that Mexico has to pay for it,
right,
and I'm going to get off of NAFTA, what do you think would be the implication? What should we be really concerned, given your approach in terms of not necessarily agreements are necessary for this kind of being able to participate in global value chains?
Well, so let's go all the way to the end of that question and say, what if NAFTA got destroyed? I think you have to remember that a lot of the global value chains in Asia are set up without trade agreements, so or at least not as deep as NAFTA or whatever. So you can do a lot simply by getting your own house in order, by being an attractive place. Now, it won't be quite as attractive, and you'll lose some jobs, and perhaps you might not have as fast wage growth as you otherwise would have, at least for a while. But some price adjustment, some quantity adjustment will allow you to adjust to the less good access. So really, the way to think about that is, if you had a bigger wage, to put it in very simple terms, if you had a bigger wage difference between U.S. and Mexico, you could compensate for any loss of access, no matter what that was. It would just have to be big enough. And in the end, some of the processing would stay with a wage adjustment, even if you lost it, as long as Mexico keeps its very pro-business, pro-investment, a stable, good place to do business. As long as it stayed with that, the loss of the special access to the U.S. would hurt, but it wouldn't destroy it. And there's a very close analogy with what Britain's going to do with the EU. They're going to rip up their NAFTA, and Britain is not going to sink into the sea. They'll lose some manufacturing jobs. The relative wages in Britain versus the continent will go down. In fact, they already have gone down because of the pound being depreciated. And then it'll continue on. So you can deal with these things. It's just not as good. Now, to wind that back, will it actually happen? I think that you have to think about the U.S. trade policy establishment, the people who have designed U.S. trade policy, the vested interests, the large corporations, the people who have export-oriented jobs, the states. They are fighting for it, as they always have. Mm-hmm. So it's Trump's ideas are a little strange and not mainstream. They're not mainstream in the Republican Party, and he's not winning any friends for that kind of thing. Some of the Democrats support some aspects of it, and they tend to be more protectionist. But ripping up all of NAFTA so that they're not exporting corn, they're not exporting beef, those are very difficult things for him to do. So personally, I don't think he can do it. Can't rip up NAFTA. That would require Congress. What he could do, in a fit of pique, he could put up tariffs by 10%, like Nixon did. Yeah. But then would have to be across the board.
Okay, and that would make it.
That would make a huge problem
for not only with Mexico, with the rest of the world.
With the rest of the world, and Mexico undoubtedly would and should retaliate against very specific American products that are politically painful but not so disruptive.
Like we did when they started. They didn't want to comply with the
trucking.
The trucking.
Right.
Yeah, they did that, and it was magnificent.
Exactly. Well, that's every country in the world has the list of the swing voters, what they export, and that's that's essentially the balancing in WTO. So that's the standard way of doing these things. So when U.S. retaliated against Japan, or against unfair things in China, or any country does that, and I think that could be quite effective. Because right now the narrative is like us versus them, and we're being taken advantage of. But once you start unpacking it, trade is a two-way thing, and that the special interests that got American policy to where it is now are very powerful, have big influence in Congress and the state houses, and they presumably would prevent him from ripping up NAFTA all the way.
Well, yesterday there was a notice in the newspaper in Mexico saying that it's 100 CEOs of the largest companies in the United States sent a letter to Mr. Trump saying, you cannot destroy NAFTA, we need NAFTA,
right,
please,
right.
You have to support it. So
yeah,
you're right in saying
well, they're coming up. I'm glad to see. For a long time they were too shy to talk up, and this happened in Britain with Brexit as well. The financial guys who are going to be really hurt by it, they were too afraid to speak out for their own interest. And also, you know, to them they can move to New York, or it's not a terrible thing. But so I'm glad to see that was coming up.
Now I have a final question. I know that you have to go, but
my pleasure.
And you're living in Geneva.
Yeah.
What do you think is the future of the WTO? It's playing an important role in terms of dispute settlement, and in certain sectors they're negotiating, but do you think they will ever recover the role it had to play as the forum for negotiation, multilateral negotiations, so we're in a different world now?
Right. Well, so what you're talking about, what I like to call the centricity of the WTO. And in the old days, there was no doubt that the WTO was in charge of the international rules on trade. But it's interesting that it was created in the same year NAFTA was created.
Yes.
And it also needs an upgrade. But the politics are logjam, so they can't get this upgrade. So Doha for a long time, and that died a couple years ago. I think, so I'm cautiously optimistic. And we'll know a lot in the new ministerial conference that's going to be held in Buenos Aires in December. There's a move to expand the agenda into certain things. Trade facilitation, for example, and e-commerce. And some of the members, like India, are blocking it, but there may be a deal done. So December is a big turning point. Still, the way to think about the WTO is it's the rules that underpin 20th century trade, where it was mostly made here, sold there. Although they have some stuff, some global value chain things like intellectual property rights and investment measures. But 20th century trade is still with us. So countries are still trying to join the WTO and making big sacrifices to join the WTO because they want to be inside on these 20th century rules. So I think at the worst, the WTO will stay central to the 20th century trade, which is universal. You know, there's almost every country in the world is a member, and they almost all obey the rules. And people have been obeying these rules for so long, it's actually internalized. So even if the WTO is not quite as powerful, it would stay on. And then other things, I mean, for a long time we thought TPP and then TTIP would take over the other rules.
Is it done?
TPP might go. TTIP is in deep freeze.
Deep freeze.
So it's always, in my mind, TTIP would always come after TPP because it's essentially the Europeans wanting a seat at the table. They're afraid that the Americans and the Asians are going to sign all the rules, design all the rules, and then that would become the rules of the game. But so TPP is you know, as it stands, is certainly done as long as Trump stays in power, and we don't know how long that's going to be. But in any case, they've decided to try and proceed with the 11 instead of the 12, at least trying to keep it alive. I've heard different. I was in Singapore last month, and I've heard different, and Jakarta. I heard different arguments as to whether it is or is not possible. But in any case, it's not going to blow apart right away. And a few countries have done it. So I think it's going to stay parked for a while. Mostly people are hoping that the next administration will come back to join.
And hopefully it's in 3.5 years. I'm sorry, I cannot help making a wish here.
Yeah.
So, well, I really appreciate your time, and really Grupo Técnica allowing us to have this nice conversation. It's really, I'm sure it's going to be loved by our students, by our faculty, and the people who watch us.
So if I can advertise, I have a massively online course on this book, on globalization, a MOOC, you know, and it's with Future Learn.
MOOC? Oh.
Yeah, I have a MOOC, a 4-week MOOC on my book, talking about this kind of stuff. And it's with it's not Coursera, it's a platform called Future Learn, which is based out of the Open University in London.
Oh, can you join?
Yeah, for free.
For free?
Yeah.
And how do I get your name? MOOC?
Well, if you just type my name, Richard Baldwin, and globalization, you'll find it. If you put Future Learn, you also find it.
Okay.
So
I look for it.
Okay.
Probably will help me to understand the book.
Very good.
Really, I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Being
Pleasure.
Here. Okay. Nice. So you're leaving now, eh?
Yes, I'm going. I've got an event at the ECB on Wednesday, so talking about the same things.
Okay, can you imagine? Thank
Very
you.
good.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Gracias, gracias a todos, bienvenidos.